Hi everyone, and welcome to another day in hell as we dive into Kent Hovind's book, Are You Being Brainwashed? Propaganda in Science Textbooks. Oh, I don't know what part video this is. 4, 5, 6, we're on something by now. It's, you know the drill. But once again, before we kind of jump into the content and looking at his book and talking about the weird bad science in it, before we jump into this nightmare, let me reiterate this, which I've said over and over, and Kent Hovind's fans still don't seem to listen to. Yes, I know he's making video responses to me. Yes, I'm aware he's acting like a child with titles like Destroying Rachel Oates and then picking out moments for the thumbnails where I'm pulling stupid faces. I'm also aware that I've only watched a few minutes of the videos so far because I kind of got bored of them, and he was either just like getting really personal with it for no reason or trying to sell his stuff, and I found that kind of boring. But yeah, a few of my fans have told me that his main criticisms of me are basically, I dye my hair and I have a weird accent. And I'm like, sorry mate, but I'm English. Like, if you don't like the English accent, get over yourself. And if you don't like the fact that I dye my hair, get over yourself. It's not a big deal. Anyway, I haven't really felt his videos are worth my time watching at the minute, but once my planned series of videos on his book that I'm recording right now are finished and done, I may have a look at some of them, and if he has any legitimate points in them, I may respond to them, but we'll see what happens. And finally, no, I will not debate him, because debating's not really my style, and I think he's a bit of a douche, to be honest, so... And also, why does everyone constantly want me to phone his thing? Like, I'm not spending money, or time, or effort on that. Like, screw that, no. Anyway, with that boring stuff out the way, let's jump right back into the book. We've got some odd stuff to talk about today. We're only focusing on one of his points, but it is a big one. It is line number 17, which Kent thinks is DNA proves evolution. So what Kent is claiming is that is a lie, and that DNA does not prove evolution. If anything, DNA proves a creator, which we know is a bunch of crap, but let's have a look at his arguments for it and talk about them. So he writes that many books teach that humans and chimpanzees share 98.4% of the same DNA, and this proves a close relationship. This is a lie for several reasons. Firstly, I'd just like to add that, like, the similarities alone aren't what prove a close relationship. Like, that number alone isn't what prove that it's a close relationship. It's which bits are similar and which bits are different. It's looking at the actual contents of the DNA and how similar they are and in what ways it's similar. So it's not just a matter of the number, there's a lot more to it than that, and Kent is definitely kind of oversimplifying there. So he writes that Dr. Barney Maddox, a leading genetic genome researcher concerning these genetic differences, said, now the genetic difference between human and his nearest relative, the chimpanzee, is at least 1.6%. That doesn't sound like much, but calculated out, that is a gap of at least 48 million nucleotides, and a change of only 3 nucleotides is fatal to an animal. There is no possibility of change. So this sounded a bit dodgy to me, and luckily for once, Kent decided to cite his source, which he never does. So, you know, lucky for us, we could actually go and look it up. It's actually a bit of a struggle to find the original source, to be honest, but I did. And it turns out it was published by Creation Evidence magazine in 1992. So not only is this quote in this source probably quite outdated, incredibly outdated, this is a year older than me, but it's almost definitely biased because of where it comes from and who is funding it. That's a huge thing you have to look at when you're looking at scientific papers. Look at the source, who is funding it, do they have any bias in this? If they have an agenda, then there's a chance that the research is going to end up twisted. Or if they did research and it turns out that the evidence was going the other way, there's a chance they could have twisted it or not published it or whatever. When people have an agenda, you have to take what they say with a pinch of salt. And Creation Evidence magazine definitely has an agenda, because they make money directly by promoting the idea of creationism. And if they looked at any of the actual science that proves evolution, they would lose money. So we have to take the things they publish with a pinch of salt. What I found interesting to Maddox's credentials as well. So Kent calls him a leading genetic genome researcher. Yeah, I found this interesting because actually what is surprising, he does have a PhD. He's a real doctor, unlike Kent, so he can call himself that. But I didn't find any proof of him leading the field in genetic genome research. Every single thing I can find about him claims he's a urologist. Which is just a bit different, isn't it? The original article by Maddox that I found is a weird mix of misrepresentation and misunderstanding about evolution. There's a few bits of him just stating the obvious in there, which are fine, but then there's just weird bits of him like twisting the conclusions to things that just don't make sense. I could say a hell of a lot about this article, and it deserves someone sitting down and debunking it in its own right, because there is a hell of a lot to unpack here. But one thing I want to specifically talk about is this quote that Kent Hovind used, because this is the context in which it comes from. Kent took it completely out of context, and it changes the meaning. When Kent uses the quote, it implies that to change any 3 nucleotides in any DNA sequence will be fatal. This just isn't true. In the original article, Maddox was referring to 3 specific nucleotides which, when altered in a certain way, cause cystic fibrosis. Kent's use of this quote is completely dishonest. Honestly, to change any 3 nucleotides in the DNA probably won't have an effect. It's just this one certain mutation that has eventually fatal outcome. And to use this quote, this reference in this way, is completely dishonest on Kent's part. The truth is, in reality, mutations in our DNA are incredibly common. One recent paper, which is linked in the description down below, if you want to read it, they figured out that on average there's probably around 175 mutations per diploid genome per generation. That's quite a lot. If it really was the case that changing any 3 nucleotides in DNA was fatal, no one would ever be born alive. No babies would be born. That would be it. There are a few different types of mutation, and not all affect our gene expression, and therefore most go completely unnoticed. If you want to find out more about the types of DNA mutation or just this genetic stuff in general, as always, I'm going to leave some further reading and links and stuff down in the description below. As always, I try and pick sources that are very easy to understand and explain it to everyone, whether you have a background in biology or not. I want to try and make this information accessible to everyone, which is why I try and pick the kind of further reading that I do. I also recommend that you make sure you watch part 3 of this series and my video on Can Life Come From Non-Life, which is like a standalone video. In part 3 of this video in particular, I talk a lot about what mutations are, how they happen, and how they influence evolution. It's by far not like a perfect description, it's not a perfect video, but I'm pretty happy with that, and I think it does a decent job of explaining, and there's like a little analogy in there that tries to like put it quite simply. And interestingly, it's the only video in this series that Kent Hovind hasn't even tried to destroy yet. Probably because it's too science heavy for him, he got scared by the big words. Anyway, the point is, this first point by Kent is both dishonest and just completely wrong. Let's have a look at the next point. He says DNA cannot prove evolution because the difference is now known to be 5%, not 1%. And then he quotes, "It has long been held that we share 98.5% of our genetic material with our closest relatives. That now appears to be wrong. In fact, we share less than 95% of our genetic material, a 3-fold increase in the variation between us and chimps. Human-chimp DNA differences trebled," reference to new scientists, newest research says 7.7 difference. Nature. I think he screwed up the formatting a little here. He was probably just copying and pasting stuff off the internet. So, there we go. So anyway, this point basically just boils down to Kent saying, look, we once thought this, and now we think this. Therefore, God! And look, these scientists, they changed their mind when they got new information, therefore we can't trust anything they say. They're terrible people. Basically all Kent's saying, and it's kind of stupid. The truth of the matter is, if we logically and like actually look at this point and what it means is, all he's saying is, now that we've sequenced the human genome and the DNA of other animals, we have more of an idea of which bits of DNA we share and which bits are different. That's it. That's what happens in science. We find more evidence and our conclusions change a little. The fact that we now know which specific bits of DNA we share and don't share with other animals, and the fact that we can now like put a more accurate number on this, doesn't disprove evolution in the slightest. If anything, it shows us to a greater, more accurate extent how we're related to them, and we can get a better idea of where family trees and timelines split and so on. And yeah, if anything, this gives us more evidence for evolution. I don't see why his point has anything to do with DNA not proving evolution. and I don't know what point he's trying to make. He's just doing this thing that he does, and he does this a lot, where he'll come out with a random fact, and sometimes there's a grain of truth in it, and sometimes it's a little bit accurate, right? He picks one that he likes, and he likes the sound of, and he just parrots it. He does the same thing when he talks about, like, the flagellum on certain bacteria. But he picks a scientific fact, and then he parrots it. And without explaining the background to this fact, without ever understanding it himself, and without ever explaining how, he says, and this is proof of a creator, or, and this disproves evolution. But he never actually explains the steps in between fact and conclusion. He never explains how he gets there. He just thinks if he says something that sounds scientific, and then he says his conclusion with enough conviction, people will make that leap. And sadly, a lot of people do, and he has a lot of people eating up this crap. But you need to stop and ask, how do you get there? Because Kent just glosses over that bit, and there's no explanation. Anyway, back to his point in this evidence, and the only point I can actually see him trying to make is simply, we can't possibly relate it. Look, there are differences in our DNA. Which is obviously silly, because of course there are differences in our DNA. Other than identical twins, everyone has different DNA. But the cool thing about DNA is, and this is oversimplifying a lot, but I'm just trying to explain in really basic terms. The cool thing about DNA is, even though everyone's DNA is different, we can see certain patterns and markers in it. And we can use these to tell us who's related to who, and how they're related to who. It's like we can look at the DNA of us and others and so on, and we can put together a family tree and trace back who's related to who and how by looking for these markers down through the generations. And we can do this, and we can put family trees together. That's how we can do paternity tests, for example, and say, is so-and-so the father of these babies? We look for these genetic markers, right? And again, to oversimplify, the more similar our DNA is, the more closely we're related. A father will have more similar DNA to his son than the uncle will have to the kid. And the thing is, we don't just have to be doing this with individual humans. We can do this with all animals as a whole. And we can see certain markers and patterns and trends and so on. And we can trace back family histories and see how these species were related to these species and so on. It's really cool how it works. And to go back to the simple, just like, you know, the more closely our DNA is related, the closer we are. Yeah, our DNA is more similar to chimpanzees than to elephants, therefore we're more closely related to chimpanzees. This just means we have a common ancestor kind of earlier to us in the timeline than elephants, if that makes sense. The fact that, okay, we thought we had this much shared DNA, but on actual sequencing we have this much, doesn't disprove the link that we're related. It just strengthens it, because now we have an actual number to, you know, put in place. There's a hell of a lot we can learn from the DNA of animals who are currently living and old samples that we found and dated. And it's not just a matter of looking at the numbers and saying we share this much with this person and this much with this and this. It's far more complex than that. And it's very interesting. I do recommend you go and do more reading on it, because it's fascinating stuff. If you are interested in this sort of thing, and you want more detailed information, I recommend a book called Our Origins, Discovering Physical Anthropology. I know Kent won't like it because he's a textbook and he thinks all textbooks are propaganda. But unlike Kent's book, this book is thoroughly well researched and referenced, so you know, it's pretty legit. And I kind of wish I'd had this book available to me back when I was making my part 3 of this video, because that would have been useful. There's a very interesting chapter in it called Genes and Their Evolution, and it's about population genetics. I'm throwing my pen around, which is really interesting and I think definitely deserves a read. And I also recommend, if you're interested in this kind of stuff, a book called Evolution: The Human Story, which is pretty excellent, and it's also just a really beautiful book that's really enjoyable to read. But I think the big takeaway from this is that DNA alone isn't the only indicator of evolution. It's just one little bit of evidence that we have that points to the same conclusion as all the other evidence that we have. And it's not just about the numbers and matching up and saying like, well, this is 98% similar, so we can believe this, but this is only 97% similar, so we can't believe it. It's nothing like that. It's a lot more complex than that, and it's not just to do with the percentages and the numbers, but it's to do with which bits of DNA we share and which bits we don't, and so on. Kent's next point is just as ridiculous though. He writes that similarities in the DNA code simply prove the same designer wrote the code. This is not evidence for evolution, it is actually proof for creation. This is just another example of him stating a fact. The fact being, there are similarities in DNA between species. It's great that he admits that. And then he just jumps to this conclusion without explaining how he got there. His conclusion being, designer! Similarities between species don't automatically mean designer. You need to explain to me how you get there. And the fact is, it's a lot simpler and easier to believe that it's just common ancestors, because that makes sense, than to believe that it's a designer. Honestly, I don't think a designer or creator accounts for genetic change over time due to random mutations. We know that random mutations can occur. Again, see part 3 of this series. And these random mutations can occur due to errors during processes like transcription and translation, right? We know this, we've seen this, we observe it all the time. We also know that these things are naturally occurring. There's no agent consciously causing this to happen. Therefore, we know that mutations naturally occur without a conscious agent. We know this for a fact. We see this every day, multiple times a day. We know that this happens now, and therefore we can say that this has been happening for a long time. We can extrapolate back. We can make that assumption with a fairly high certainty. Even if not 100%, it makes sense that, this is the most likely thing that happened, that these mutations have been happening for a long time. And once we go back far enough, we end up with single-celled organisms, we end up with macromolecules. I don't think there's any evidence to suggest we ever needed an agent there to design the first bit of code. And I mean, if there was an agent, at what bit did he supposedly do this anyway? This is what always confuses me. Like, did he create things and then allow them to mutate and change naturally by themselves without any conscious involvement from one thing or another? Or does he, I don't know, what did he do, and at what point did he supposedly create them and make them? Did he put the little, atoms on Earth, or did he make the macromolecules? Did he make the single-celled organisms? Did he make multicellular organisms? But only some of them, not all of them. It makes no sense. Evolution does make sense. I also find him calling DNA a literal code problematic. It's not a code in the same sense that a computer uses a code to function. Using analogies like this, and again, this is another thing that Kent Hovind does a lot. When someone uses an analogy, he picks apart the analogy, but not the original, fact or whatever. Analogies are simply teaching tools. We're drawing a comparison to say, look, this idea is complex or abstract. Let's use something familiar to try and explain it a little bit better, to show how it's similar. Doesn't mean they work in exactly the same way. You're just trying to use it as a teaching tool to explain this complex, abstract thing a little easier. That's all there is to it. Comparing DNA to a computer code is an analogy, but it's not a perfect one, and they're not identical. To call DNA a code is analogous, it's metaphorical. DNA, in a literal sense, in a physical sense, is simply a bunch of atoms interacting in specific ways with each other based on their structures and properties and the laws of the universe. Again, for more information about what DNA is and how it works and how it functions, check out part 3 of this video and also my Can Life Come From Non-Life videos. I talk quite a bit about it there, and I'm conscious of not repeating myself to you guys too much. So yeah, my point is basically that while a computer code might need a programmer or a creator or whatever to some extent, we're not saying that DNA is a literal computer code. Therefore, to say that if this one thing needs a creator, this other thing needs a creator, because that's not true. We've never seen proof of, I guess, any naturally occurring thing like DNA or cells or whatever like that. We've never seen proof of an agent creating them and them only being able to come from that. We have seen proof of them replicating and so on naturally, without an agent to control them, without an agent consciously making the choice to say, okay, now you divide, now you do this, now you do this. So, I'm worried I'm rambling again, sorry. Okay, next up, he argues that DNA is so incredibly complex that the chances of just one DNA molecule arranging itself by chance has been estimated to be 1 in 10 to the 119,000. That is a huge number when you consider the entire visible universe is only 10 to the power of 28 inches in diameter. So the first thing I want to clarify here is what exactly Kent means by the term one DNA molecule. That's a surprisingly vague term. And since Kent didn't include any references, again, I decided to Google this little statistic here. And the first result was some dodgy creation versus evolution website. Once again, no references to anything legit. this website I found uses an even vaguer term than one DNA molecule. They simply call it one DNA. Like, what the hell is one DNA? Oh my god. So I decided to look up, you know, what is one DNA molecule to see if this is like an actual measure that people use. And the consensus is basically, it's not, but the consensus is basically that it's either one strand of DNA or one double strand of DNA or one chromosome. So it could be anything. One DNA molecule could be anything at this point. And Kent doesn't explain whether he's referring to human DNA, he doesn't explain whether he's referring to a certain animal's DNA, he doesn't explain whether he's referring to like a single strand of DNA, a double strand of DNA, a human chromosome, like nothing. So, for the sake of simplicity, let's assume this statistic here is referring to one human chromosome. But the next point is, who the hell cares? Because either way, his point proves absolutely nothing. Because the human chromosome, a single strand of DNA, whatever you want to call it, the human chromosome, as we know it today, has never randomly arranged itself by chance in the way that it currently is today, in the way that we know it. That doesn't happen, and no one is claiming it did or has. It's taken billions of years for DNA to become as complex as we know it to be today. Billions of years. Again, I talk about this stuff in my other videos, so I don't want to repeat myself so much, but none of this exactly happened by chance. Yes, certain mutations were random, but still, there are kind of factors affecting how and when and why that happens. So again, not completely random. And just the structure of DNA, how it all works, how it all functions, why these things arrange themselves in these ways, and so on. It all comes back to atoms wanting to be as stable as possible. And I think it's in my Does Life Come From Non-Life video that I talk about this, but they want to interact with each other following the laws of physics. They form molecules which interact with each other and so on. To oversimplify things again, we're never actually talking about the possibility of DNA as we know it randomly forming. Instead, we need to look at, okay, what's the chance of an oxygen and a hydrogen molecule interacting? And the fact is there's millions, billions of these molecules all over the planet, the universe. There's chances of these happening all the time and not happening and so on. So we look and we say, okay, what's the chance of this? Cool, okay. Well, okay, now what's the chance of simple molecules starting to form? What's the chance of macromolecules forming? What's the chance of this macromolecule interacting with this macromolecule? And so on. What's the chance of this and this forming this kind of bond if they're near each other? What's the chance of this and this forming a kind of bond if they're near each other? And so on. It's lots of little things happening and building up over a long period of time with lots of factors influencing the outcome. It's not a bunch of little molecules all saying randomly, gonna be human DNA today, and then just randomly happening. No one is claiming that is happening or has ever happened. No one is claiming a strand of human DNA just formed randomly. That's not the claim. And also the fact that he's trying to compare this to the size of the universe is so, like, arbitrary and weird. Like, this has nothing to do with anything, and it's ridiculous to try and compare these numbers. He's just taking two big numbers and saying, look how much bigger this is than this. It's just for shock value. There's no inherent meaning to it. It's stupid. And he's actually using the wrong number. The size of the visible universe isn't 10 to the power of 28. It's 3.36 times 10 to the power of 28. He just missed off the first part. So I'm not entirely sure that Kent understands, like, standard form notation. Because that's a pretty big thing to miss off. So there you go. Yeah. Anyway, with this is where I'm going to end this today. In the next video, we're going to be looking at the last lie in this book, and then he starts going on about, like, what we can do about this, and we're definitely getting down to the last couple of videos in this series now, thankfully. It's kind of doing my head in, I'll be honest. But yeah, let me know what you thought of this, and DNA, and all sorts. This was a bit of a weird video, because a lot of the stuff I wanted to talk about is stuff that I've already covered, so I didn't want to repeat myself too much. Sorry if this was a weird one, I'm not sure. But yeah, I'm just gonna stop talking, you know. Thank you for watching today. I appreciate you guys so much. And yeah, I'll see you again soon. Huge thank you to everyone supporting me on Patreon this month, with a special thank you going to Data Jack, Trae Sprowles, Gambit and Chauffeur, Liv's Pantyhose Addiction, Mark Dauner, Christian Berg, Nathalie Romer, Simon Lundh, Jadeon Sheppard, Robert Korte, Peter Kyrouac, Sir Michael Moore, Christina the Atheist, Sage Villarreal and Loren Hart. You guys and everyone supporting me on Patreon are absolutely amazing, and I couldn't do this without you, so thank you so much. And remember, if you are supporting me on Patreon, you can get exclusive access to my Discord server where you can come join in the conversation. So hopefully I'll see you guys over there. And thank you all so much!